Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Homeroom with Education Leaders. We're really excited about today's panel, supporting English language learners during distance learning. We have a great panel lined up for you. My name is Julia Cunningham. I am a senior policy analyst here at the Hunt Institute. And I'd like to thank our wonderful panelists that we have today, Superintendent Hansel King from the District of Columbia, Commissioner Angelica Fonte Green from Rhode Island, Delia Pompa from the Migration Policy Institute, and Superintendent Karen Salmon of Maryland. We know that there's a lot of work for all of you to do at the moment, and so we really appreciate you taking the time out of your incredibly busy schedules to have these important discussions. Just a couple quick notes. If you've missed any of our past conversations, this is, I think, our 9th webinar in this series, then you can find them on our website. This includes full video as well as blog recaps of each of the webinars. We also have all of our other webinar opportunities listed on there as well. After our opening remarks, we'll hear from our distinguished panelists for about 30 minutes, and then we'll pivot to a Q&A. We will not be opening up the lines. We will not be unmuting them. Just there's a number of people on here. It would get a little hectic. So if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them through the Q&A feature. And if you include your name and title, we'll be sure to give you proper credit. One last note before we get started, we'd love to hear from you on social media. And so if you have any questions or comments or anything throughout, please feel free to either tweet at the Hunt Institute or you can use the hashtag #EdHomeroom to let us hear your thoughts. I'd now like us to get started by asking the Hunt Institute's President and CEO, Dr. Javed Siddiqui, to provide some quick opening remarks for us.
Thanks, Julia. I want to echo your thanks to and gratitude to our panelists. It's a really dynamic group of professionals we have today. I'm excited to hear your thoughts. Our conversation today is going to focus on English language learners. ELL teachers everywhere have had to rapidly adapt in order to support their students from a distance. We know that multilingual families work incredibly hard to expose their children to high-quality learning opportunities. But because of this digital divide, many families will be relegated to learning materials that are difficult to navigate, even if produced in their native language. And because of this, the equity gap is likely to widen as digitally connected and tech-savvy students are able to more easily move forward with learning, compounded by the many ways school closures are impacting more vulnerable students. So I'm excited to hear what our panelists' perspectives are on this topic and on this issue this morning. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Julia to get our conversation going.
Thanks so much, Javed. I'd like to get started by welcoming Delia Pompa. She is a senior fellow for education policy at the Migration Policy Institute, and she's also on the Hunt Institute's board, so we're thrilled to have her here today. Delia, can you speak a little bit nationally about some of the work that we're seeing, these creative solutions that we're seeing around the country to support English language learners at this time during the remote learning or distance learning or whatever learning may look like for these students?
Thank you.
Oh, and Delia, there we go.
First, let me acknowledge that there are a number of issues that all of us know about. I think we need to get that on the table first. That the population of English learners is particularly vulnerable during this time just because of the added stressors on their education, on their family life, and what this pandemic is causing an entire community. But there have been really positive responses all around the country, ranging from responses at the local level, some responses at the federal level that I think are very helpful. The issues that we see, we've pulled out a few issues at MPI. We actually have a paper coming out on September 22nd, I hope all of you will look at, that talks about the policy implications of the response to this pandemic in terms of how English learner students are faring. But if you pull out the big issues, they tend to be about 6 issues that are different for these kids than they would be for others. One is just the severity of the impact, because these children are learning a language, and so you've got language loss and on top of academic loss. A second has to do with the specialized training teachers need to work with English learners. A third is the resources that are needed in regular times, and now there are even more resources needed for these students. And then the role of the state education agency and what that's playing, what role that agency is playing in helping local districts. Other than that, we're seeing some, in addition to the funding issues, the issue of reaching out to a community that doesn't always speak the language that the institutions do, also that has layers of other social emotional responses because of their immigration status. So what are we seeing around the country? It's what you asked me to talk about. One, we're seeing districts and CBOs and states that are going beyond their usual efforts to train English teachers of English learners. We've seen, for example, in Californians Together pulled together a cohort of teachers who are working specifically in a series of workshops on how to do remote learning with English learners. We are seeing community-based organizations step up and help parents with translations. Not only that, they're helping these parents access the internet, working within their communities to get this business community involved to increase the funding going toward access to internet, and also sometimes providing internet access themselves. And we're also seeing them secure for these families all kinds of hardware that they need for their students to engage in schooling. We're also seeing adjustments on the school district level. A couple of districts that we know about, Boston Public Schools, Albemarle, Virginia, looking at serving English learners as a priority group in-person learning. In-person learning is extremely important for English learners just because they need to be around other people who are speaking English so that they have role models. And so a few districts have picked up on that and are prioritizing these kids for in-person learning. We are also seeing responses from the federal government. The federal government has issued a couple of letters that were helpful to school districts. One letter that came early in March was urging districts to protect the rights from the Office of Civil Rights, protect their rights to language access and also to be treated in a fair and unbiased way along receiving the same things other students were receiving. And that's an important message from the federal government. A second message was much more technical and had to do with assessment. As you all know, assessment requirements have been suspended for the school year 2019-2020. And so there was guidance that was issued to school districts. It's not always easy to follow it, but there are efforts being made. I know we'll have time to talk about this later, and I just have a few minutes, but suffice it to say that we're seeing responses from people who want to help, but don't necessarily know how to help right now. We have a lot to learn about how to educate very vulnerable groups of kids during something like this pandemic.
Thank you so much, Delia. That provides a really helpful context for the rest of our conversation. And I'd now like to turn us over to Superintendent Salmon from Maryland. And I know that Superintendent Salmon, you'd like to provide some opening remarks around what Maryland is doing right now. And you actually have a couple slides to provide a visual for us. So I'll let you go ahead and get that set up. Oh, and you are still on mute, just an FYI.
Actually, Julia, I have decided to err on the side of talking instead of trying to do both at the same time. So,
great, sounds good.
I'll make the PowerPoint available to you and you can post it later on your website. Yes. But I want to make sure I don't make any missteps in the information that I'm communicating. It's interesting, in Maryland, we have over 900,000 students, and approximately 10% of those students are our EL students. That's about 93,000 students. And we have about 200 different languages that are spoken by these students. Of course, the top languages are Spanish, French, Chinese, and Arabic. But I think it's just interesting that everyone thinks that, you know, we can have teachers that can translate in all of the different languages to teach our children. And it's just such a fallacy that, you know, we're trying to teach them English. So it's kind of interesting. When we went through, we had a state of emergency declared on March the 5th by the governor. And as soon as we went into that state of emergency, the State Department of Education provided a continuity of learning guideline for all of our 24 Maryland school districts. We're very lucky in Maryland to have just 24 districts with 24 superintendents, so it's easy to communicate. throughout the state. And we provided some provisional guidelines for English language learners. We also provided tons of distance learning resources, and we did webinars with teachers across the state immediately. We also started hosting weekly meetings with the English language coordinators in each of the 24 systems, so that when issues came up, we could help them and provide support immediately. We learned some very early on that within 3 areas, we learned a lot of lessons. One was in instructional strategies, one social emotional learning, and the other was family engagement. What we learned in the instructional mode was that we had many teachers, EL teachers, planning and co-planning and co-teaching with their content teachers during the virtual learning platforms. And so we were showing how to use more visuals, graphic organizers, use multimedia to enhance that learning and comprehension for these students. We provided more synchronous instruction to enhance their engagement and learning. We found that was really important. We were offering office hours for the students to check in with their teachers, providing home language support when it was appropriate, and offering paraprofessionals to provide individualized support and tutoring. We also learned to be very patient and flexible. In terms of social and emotional learning, we were providing professional development in trauma-informed practices to these teachers and staff. We know that it's important to build strong teacher-student relationships in the beginning of the school year by incorporating community building and engagement activities, so those are ongoing right now. We also created opportunities for students to be able to share their feelings and needs, and offered that individualized connection, which we think is really important for the families and the students to be able to check in on their emotional well-being throughout the pandemic. In terms of family engagement, we used interpreters across the state to share timely information about the school system and the virus with families, and also try to respond to their needs and questions. We offered those personal check-ins, and we collaborated with local organizations and faith-based organizations and immigrant communities to provide information and resources. Wanted to share one success story. This spring, a team in Carroll County Public Schools hand-packed and delivered a family resource bag to each of their 400 English learners in grades pre-K through 12. And the families were really excited about that because they got activity guides, school supplies, and certainly information about distance learning. And I think that was really, really helpful to them. MSDE, the State Department, put together a Maryland Together recovery plan for education. We actually published it in May, and we are now evaluating all the local school system plans from the 24 school systems. And within that guideline document, and it's on our website, there is very good guidance on how we are dealing with our EL population, and also how we are providing enrollment information for school systems, because that's a huge issue right now for people coming in. I have to just interject. Yesterday I was in a rural school system on the Eastern Shore in Caroline County, and they have brought back in person groups of students, students with disabilities, they're EL students, and I was able to visit a high school, middle school, and an elementary school and watch these students learning with their teachers, but also they were doing Zoom lessons with their content level teachers at the same time. So their EL teachers were actually in the classroom, able to support their instruction in their content classes. It was really great to see, and it was also great to see students who were very excited to be back in school with their EL teacher. So let's see. I think that was really all I wanted to share, just that our recovery plan is online, and we certainly are going to be continuing to enhance our services to our EL students and make sure that we have great communication with our local school systems and that they have great communication with their parents and students. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's exciting to see students being back in the classroom and excited about learning. And I know that that's something that a lot of students have missed over the last few months. So that's great to hear. I'm going to turn now to Superintendent Kang. And Superintendent Kang, I know DC is kind of in a unique situation for the rest of the country. And so could you talk a little bit about what DC is doing now and is thinking about long-term for supporting EL students?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. And I really appreciate Delia's overview. I think we similarly at my office in DC are thinking about what our appropriate role is as the state education agency and how we can serve our students and our support our local education agencies and schools as they are seeking to serve our students and families. Even though DC is not yet formally a state, the office that I lead is the state education agency for DC, and we actually have more than 60 different local education agencies within our area that we are supporting. And so here in DC, our vision is that all English learners will have equitable, meaningful access to high quality academic and linguistic programs in an inclusive, welcoming environment, and that schools will include EL students specifically as a valued part of their vision for the school and students' success. And so just by way of background, we do have a growing population of English learners. They currently make up about 12% of our total student population and speak more than 80 languages. And in DC, we also have the benefit of some local legislation that requires that official and formal documents are translated into the 6 most common languages in DC, which includes Spanish, French, Mandarin, Amharic, Vietnamese, and Korean among them. Amharic, I think, is at this point the 2nd or 3rd most common after Spanish. So we're really proud that our students who go through the process of learning English in DC schools and then exit from EL status actually perform quite well on our state content assessments at actually the same or higher levels than students who were never identified as English learners. So we're really proud to see that performance over time and the way in which we are supporting those students. And that's part of our overall goal, that we want to ensure that all of our students who go through the process of learning English in our schools are able to participate in high quality education that equips them with the knowledge and the skills necessary for language proficiency as well as grade level content mastery, and then supports them in whatever they want to go on to do, whether that's preparation for college and or careers. So in thinking about the work that we've been doing, there's really 4 areas that I wanted to speak to. The first is a set of continuous education guiding principles, which were the foundation for our work. And then briefly, I'll talk about supports for our students and families, some important policy guidance that we've issued, and then professional learning and technical assistance. So on continuous education, at the beginning of this summer, my team really stepped back to think about, with the uncertainty around this coming school year, whether it was going to be in person or virtual or hybrid, and knowing that we may have to shift back and forth between those formats over the course of the year, we really wanted to step back and say, what are the core principles that we need to hold to regardless of setting, and that schools and LEAs need to plan for their students' experience this year. And we defined those as a set of guiding principles that fell into 3 pillars. One was high expectations, the second was equity and access, and the third was family engagement. And an important component of the equity and access pillar was around serving English learners, making very clear that their civil and educational rights needed to be met regardless of the learning environment. And so we have used those principles as the basis for LEA plans that we are also in the process of reviewing. We're very close to finalizing and publishing all of those, and then also as the basis for a number of the supports that we are providing as the state education agency. So as it relates to supports for students and families, one of the things we've really tried to emphasize in our work is knowing that our English learners are certainly not a homogenous group and have had diverse experiences. But as Delia noted, knowing that many of our immigrant communities have been particularly affected by the pandemic, both economically and in terms of health outcomes. And yet we also, while very much being aware of and conscious of those challenges and how we need to address them, we've also talked a lot about how we can make sure to recognize the assets and the resilience of our immigrant communities as well, and that of our students, and make sure that we are remembering and tapping into those assets as part of our approach. And so for those reasons, we've made a point of calling out the importance of providing family-facing materials in a language that the family can understand, and providing supports to families on how to use technology, how to have access to devices, but also how to facilitate that learning at home, knowing that that partnership is more essential than ever between schools and families. We also know how important schools can be in connecting families to the other kinds of resources they may need, whether that's food distribution, physical and mental health services, or other types of important services at this time. As it relates to policy guidance, we have released guidance on important required steps around identifying English learners, recognizing that we may need to adjust that process this year, but that it is still an essential step. So we've developed a provisional English learner identification procedure with input from our Title III Advisory Committee and from an interagency English learner working group that our staff has led. And then our goal is to ensure that screening continues to happen so that our students can still benefit from an English language development program and get the services they need without delay, even if they're in a virtual posture. And so we're providing supports to LEAs so that they are using this provisional screening procedure, and then also encouraging them and highly recommending that they have steps in place to ensure that full screening does take place as soon as it can and still occurs with fidelity. And finally, I'll just note that we've also been very focused on professional learning and technical assistance. This summer, we led a professional development series that focused on culturally responsive approaches to supporting EL students' well-being, engaging families as partners. Again, I think that'll be a common theme this call, providing language and academic instruction, and then formative assessment using both content and language proficiency lenses. And so we will continue to provide PD to our educators so that they can best serve our students who are English learners.
Thank you so much, Superintendent, and thank you again for the reminder about thinking about community's assets. I think that's such an important thing to think about in all of this work, especially when we are focusing on that equity lens. And now I'd like to turn to Commissioner Fonte Green from Rhode Island. Commissioner, thank you again for being here today. I'd love to hear from you a little bit about how Rhode Island is approaching this.
Sure. So in Rhode Island, like you've heard, our multilingual learners are 16% of our population. So it's pretty big, and it's really concentrated in our urban ring. There are over 100 languages spoken. Unlike what you've heard before, I've been here a little over a year, and this is an area that I care really deeply about. A couple of things were happening. Our kids were scoring less than 10% on any of our exams, and in some cases, single digits. And what I also found was the disparity in attendance. Our students that are multilingual learner were actually 25% of our former Ls were chronically absent. And then our current were at 34%. So it's really high. So there's a mismatch, right? And I think part of that is that this population has not been a priority in Rhode Island. So we have made it a priority. So the first thing that we engaged in that all connects to everything that's happened after the pandemic, but pre-pandemic, we started looking at our policy, our regulations. What does it mean? How are we prioritizing this population? We are in the process of now unveiling our blueprint for multilingual success, which we included teachers, parents, politicians, educators, superintendent, principals across the state in this conversation about how we prioritize this community and how we make funding decisions, everything that we do. So we wanted to expand our constituency group as we did this work. So we're ready to release that. But along with the blueprint, we're creating not just a vision for the state, but our expectations and our priorities and a set of interrelated principles to strengthen education policy, right? So that's our work. How do we strengthen it around all of the things that we know are important? So what we've also done is we have a new home language identification survey, which is really important for us because we were missing a big subset of kids. So that's what we've put in place prior and during the pandemic. We finished the blueprint during the pandemic. So as the pandemic unfolded, one of the things that we did was make sure that every single parent had access to Wi-Fi and a device for the entire state. That for us was really important. It wasn't that, we some communities had or others didn't. We just made it a priority that we got everyone the Wi-Fi, but getting the Wi-Fi wasn't enough, as well as the technology, was having videos in multiple languages for families on how to actually access, how to troubleshoot, because it becomes a barrier if you're not familiar, if you don't have it. We activated hotspots for parents with their cell phones too, so they could have access. The other thing that was really important for us is that we got a 24-hour helpline and bilingual helpline for parents on technology, if their kids were going through some sort of anxiety, what were they thinking, how to communicate with the education system, what their rights were or are. The other piece that we put in place is that in March, when we closed our schools for the first time, every plan, online digital plan, had to prioritize multilingual learners. That was like a non-negotiable. And that was, we kind of turned on a dime in a week. But then now our statewide plans, every single plan has to prioritize bringing our multilingual learners back in person. Every single district that we have, there's no exception here. So we expect that to happen. And then we also expect to have every single plan also had to include how they were going to communicate with the families, whether by phone, email, in a language that they can understand. It's part of what's required on a weekly basis for the parents and the teachers to be working together. We put out a survey during the pandemic in multiple languages with the governor to ask parents how is it going? What are the supports? We heard overwhelmingly from the parents, particularly in the Spanish community, how satisfied they were with actually being connected to the school in a way that they hadn't. Even though the pandemic has been hard, we're trying to view this as, what are the opportunities that we have here, right? What are the opportunities? So we're connecting with families in ways that make sense for them, right? If I'm working, I don't know how many hours, I need to have people communicate on my time frame, where we schedule it together, not just as an individual day, and how do we move back and forth. And it's really having those conversations that have been really important for us. We've also done town halls with the governor in Spanish to answer the questions for families, right? Like we have these press conferences in English where they're translated, but how are we communicating with families, with the immigrant community? How have we, so we have really taken this on. In the state of Rhode Island, our Latino community has been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. We have a town called Central Falls, which is 1 square mile, and it has the highest incidence of Latino cases in the nation in 1 square mile. So what we're thinking for that community is something a little different, is the students that can't come in because their parents, might be, almost every other family is impacted, is paying the parents to be able to stay home and do the work with the students, as well as them taking a course that will lead to something for them as well. So it's kind of like the whole family approach. So we're looking at that a little differently. One of the other things is that we put out bilingual grants. So we believe in bilingual education. We believe in using the language as an asset for them to learn English. We all know that that's the fastest way to learn English. So we've put that out and encouraging. And then now with a lot of the resources being digitally, how are you bringing in the home language? How are you bringing in resources? What is the asynchronous learning look like? What is the synchronous? Obviously we want more synchronous, but can the asynchronous be a follow-up to what they've already learned or pre-learning? Like just really using where we are right now to strengthen everything that happens. So even though you might be coming in person, you can have some videos available for them to do after school, to do as part of their homework, making it more alive as just an only print rich. But for us, it's really having grade level instruction in whatever platform and prioritizing this population. That for us has been really, really important. And that's what we're pushing statewide, is to really amp up the rigor and the standards right now and this pandemic. So that's our expectation. We're working with districts, we're providing professional development. Statewide, we have never done that. We created a statewide calendar to help us actually have professional development. And in that statewide calendar, we included 8 days of professional development, that those will be distance learning days for the students. And we're moving ahead with prioritizing this population. And those PD sessions should include and are required to include work around this population. So those are some of the things that we're doing. I think I covered everything, but at the end of the day, the policy, my job is to ensure that we're aligning policy with our expectations, and that certification matches, that everything else that we do is rowing in the same direction, where this is not something as an add-on, but really leading with this population.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. And I think you bring up a really important point around balancing that grace and patience with students who have been impacted and their families who've been impacted, but also that rigor that's going to bring them to the next level. So I think that's a really important reminder. Thank you. We have about half an hour left. I'd like to turn us now to some Q&A. We have had so many questions sent in, which is really exciting, and a lot of questions sent in beforehand. But because of that, I'm going to encourage our panelists to try to keep it as brief as we can so that we can get through as many as we can in the next 20 or so minutes. And as a reminder, if you have any more questions, please feel free to send them in. We will be doing a Twitter town hall with some of our panelists next week so that we can answer some more of these questions that weren't answered today. So I'm going to go back to Delia. Delia, can you talk a little bit, we talked about opportunity that we see here. Can you talk a bit about some of those long-term, high-quality supports that we might see as a result of this pandemic in the long term?
Sure. Let's all stipulate first that the academic piece and what we learn and how we use instruction to benefit English learners is going to be key, a key learning out of this. But there are some other things that I hope that people will, it'll stick in their mind afterwards, and will realize that, you know, laying bare all these facts is going to make us improve these areas. The first is the technology gap. I think we all know what the technology gap is. Just using Latino students as a proxy, about a third of them don't have access to the internet. 17% don't have access to any digital device. So getting that in order first is something that I hope we have a long-term solution to, and work will continue after this pandemic. Digital literacy gap for adults related to that, but it's a totally separate issue. 67% of immigrants don't have any digital literacy skills. The kind of work they do doesn't require it. They don't get training in it. They don't have support for it. And quite frankly, they're so busy supporting their kids, they don't have time to go out and learn this. So what can we do in adult education long-term to make sure everybody has digital literacy gaps? And digital literacy support and skills. The third piece of this that I think is important long-term is something that we learn now. I heard everybody talk about it, and that's the partnerships between community-based organizations and schools in serving immigrants. The importance of the trust that the community-based organizations have already built with these families, the importance of their role in the community and rallying the community to provide resources, and then the importance of them getting information to these families. The schools often have trouble getting information to these families. The fact that the community-based organizations have ongoing relationships with them really, really helps, and I hope we'll capitalize on that in the future. Finally, one issue that we haven't talked about that I hope we'll look at long-term is the importance of ongoing data collection, diagnosis, and assessment for English learners. We all realize that the assessments have stopped for this year. I'm so pleased to hear Superintendent Kang talk about the screeners they've developed as a stopgap effort and the language assessment. But we've got to find a way coming out of this to make sure we have good ongoing data collection about English learners, and also assessment that's ongoing and gives us the information we need as we're shaping instruction.
Thank you so much, Delia. And I'm actually going to switch now to Superintendent and Commissioner Fonte Green, and kind of along this same thread. A supportive classroom environment is just such an important and key aspect of any classroom, but can be particularly important for EL students. And so what are some ways that teachers can think about setting up that safe and collaborative learning environment when students are learning virtually?
Well, I think it's the first piece is really getting to know them and their families. I think that that's key. And I think also one of the things that we learned during this whole process was not being judgmental, right? I think that, you know, sometimes you have, you know, extended family member living there. And the things that we ask parents to do are from a perspective of a very different community sometimes, right? And I think that that caused a lot of challenges and raised some red flags for teachers. And at the end of the day, if I have 3 siblings in one table, that's where we're gonna work. I, as the adult, have to make accommodations and provisions for that. So that means that we had to get the kids headphones, right? It's not our place to say you adapt. It's us adapting as the adults. And I mentioned this earlier, is how do we provide resources in the home language as kind of like a bridge, but also how do we provide those additional resources? And how do we collaborate? For us, the most important piece has been collaborating throughout the state teachers to really learn from one another and set up the classrooms and really have those resources and supports, and really making sure that any of the curriculum that we buy, whether it be online or work, that it really caters to this population, right? That is front and center for us. And that's how we have moved during this pandemic and moving forward. But I think that that's really been important. But having the parent as an integral part, other classroom teachers in terms of content area teachers, to be able to bridge and have that working relationship has been really important for us as we move forward. And as I mentioned, the synchronous, it's very important. I almost said it in Spanish. I almost said sumamente. It's really important for our kids, but also making everything else that's available accessible. Like just pen and paper, those days are gone. How do we, you know, we talk about, you know, visuals and this kind of stuff, but it's more than just that now, right? Now we have these things at our fingertips. So how do we look at practice that's research-based, and we move forward and we look at data? Back to Delia's point, I think that for us here in Rhode Island, we had not been looking at data. We put out data for this population for the first time in this last year. And when we're having conversations with teachers, superintendents, principals, well, what does your data say? What is your data telling you? Where do you need to focus in on? How do you group kids? How do you figure out how to support them in the classroom? And I think those are the really deep and rich conversations that we can have. So let's say that some of the classes are distance learning or whatever the case, who are we pairing them up with? Who are the teachers that can support in that work? And at the end of the day, in person is better for this population, but I think we can support digitally in ways that we never thought we could.
There we go. Thank you so much, Commissioner. And I know the Commissioner has another meeting to get to, unfortunately. We've really enjoyed having you here, and we're sorry you had to leave a little early, but thank you so much for being here. And we will see you next week on the Twitter Town Hall. So we're excited to have more of your insight then.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, so now I'm going to switch over to Superintendent Salmon. Superintendent, can you talk a bit more about, I know we've addressed this briefly, about how Maryland is thinking about parental support for English learners. Many parents, may themselves not feel comfortable with English, and really, as we've said, one of these most crucial elements of remote learning is parental support. So how do we encourage that? How do we make that more possible?
Well, in our State Department of Education, we have a family engagement division because we think it's that important that we have a whole group of people that are working on just that kind of an issue with all of our families of our students with disabilities, our families with our English learners. These are very crucial things for us to do. And what we do is we provide the professional development for the local school systems to show them the research-based programs that are effective. so that we're not spinning our wheels out there and trying different things that aren't going to work. And so, you know, we're really hopeful that our school systems are using these research-based programs that we are adopting, and also that they are really getting into the communities. That is the biggest area that I've seen success with, especially in some of our most rural counties. And as I said yesterday, being in one of those county schools, I saw probably 50 parents of students in registering their students for learning this year. And, you know, many were our Latino parents. We really do have to reach out because sometimes those messages don't get out. And as someone mentioned earlier, we need to do more in the native languages of people so they can truly understand what's happening. And it's not such a mystery. School shouldn't be a mystery. School should be open to everybody, and it should be really easy to get our students involved in learning. And they really need to have that support from us.
Thank you. And Superintendent Kang, just kind of along similar veins, there's so much going on in the news right now. We've addressed some of the challenges that immigrant communities are facing when it comes to higher rates of COVID, but also just with the protests and the general unrest and the elections and everything going on, it can be really confusing for students to hear. How can teachers support students while they're hearing these things and going through these changes, especially when they're not processing it necessarily in their native language?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think back to something that Commissioner Fonte Green was talking about around just the importance of building positive relationships, which obviously can feel especially challenging in this virtual environment, but is more important, I think, than ever. And so one really critical part of building positive relationships with English learners is creating a space where students feel like they are valued and can feel comfortable sharing their stories and their lived experience. And this can be important for all students, but I think it takes extra effort to build a space that feels comfortable enough to share stories that can be this painful or that can raise fears in this particular way. And so one of the things we recommend is training and support for all educators on culturally responsive approaches to supporting English learners, students' well-being, and to the legal rights of immigrant students so that people feel fluent in talking about those rights, including for undocumented students who of course have a right to a public education in the United States without having to disclose that status. And thinking then also about how to bring students' reflections into instruction in a way that empowers the voice and the agency of multilingual students. I think about a really incredible series that a group of DC students led prior to the pandemic. It was a group of students from Cardozo Education Campus that they called the Inspiring Voices series. And it was organized by students with the support of one of their teachers, but they were really just sharing what their diverse experiences had been as students who had come to the United States, most of them during their high school years, and were just sharing what their experiences had been in ways that they'd found their own voice. And they invited their fellow students, families, members of the community, education leaders to just come and hear this series. And it was so powerful to hear them not only telling their own stories, but having organized this series on their own, and I think the sense of power they felt in being able to draw people in who wanted to hear their stories. And so I think about that teacher and just how powerful it was for her to give her students that space and that agency and say, you know, I want you to tell your stories, but I'm also not going to be the one that organizes this. I'm going to help you do it. And so for educators to think about how they are creating those spaces for all of my students, including my students who are English learners, and meeting them where they are, and how can I integrate their linguistic and cultural resources into instruction. And then the last thing I'll just say is that we recognize that teachers themselves are also under incredible stress during this time with having to find new ways of teaching, thinking about how they are fighting inequity and as well as the pandemic itself. And so we just also encourage teachers to make sure that they are thinking about self-care practices and resources, and also ways to connect with one another. I think that is a theme during this pandemic, that it can feel very isolating for all of us. I was talking to Justin Lopez Cardozi, who's the DC 2020 Teacher of the Year, who's talking about just, again, how challenging it feels to be finding new ways of teaching after being an experienced and an award-winning teacher already, but having to find different ways of connecting with students and thinking about instruction. But also that just that importance of helping educators to connect with one another. And so for building leaders and LEA leaders, as well as state leaders, I just encourage us to think about that too, not only the PD we're providing, but also how we're giving teachers space to connect with one another as well.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to go now back to Delia. And can we talk a bit about how we get past just these, the compliance and with interpretation and translation of materials and really get into those culturally appropriate and responsive practices? I mean, how do we build that in schools? How do we make it part of the framework that schools have, particularly for those who might not have staff who speak those other languages or who come from a similar background to the students they're teaching?
That's a huge and very unfair question, but I'll try. That's a tough question. I think there are layers to it. There are levels. I think what Superintendent Kang just mentioned is seeing people as people and having relationships. I think you begin to see some needs that are below the surface that aren't just the sort of rote instructional, this is how I do this, but understanding who you're teaching and what they're understanding, what they're learning, and what they're not is a key piece of that. So a lot of self-awareness training among people who are teaching kids about their own feelings, about race and about ethnicity, I think is important. I think a second piece of that that's really important is to begin to understand how language embeds everything we do with English learners, and how instruction for English learners has to be so rich in language, and we have to function so, as instructors, so much on the level of being clear about everything we're doing and asking questions of students when we're not clear to see what they're understanding and what they're not understanding. A third piece of that is just a lot more outside the classroom, which is understanding the community you're teaching and understanding the values of parents. We don't often ask parents what they want their children taught, what they learn in the home, what they want their children to grow up to be. Those kinds of things are really important contextual factors when it comes to responsive teaching, culturally responsive teaching. We can't underestimate the sort of or the technological aspect of teaching, and I mean that not just in terms of digital devices, but in terms of what we know, what skills are important, what we've learned over the time that over history about what are good, effective instructional principles. So embedding those instructional principles in that awareness of language, the awareness of culture, connections with families, I think is very important.
Thank you. And Superintendent Salmon, this question is from Dr. Samuel Lopez. He's a senior education program specialist at the Office of English Language Acquisition for the Department of Ed. And he was wondering about what are public and private entities who serve ELs during COVID-19 doing to kind of network and support each other and collaborate with each other and hear each other's ideas to really provide the greatest service delivery to students?
Well, that's a great question, and those kind of conversations would occur during our weekly calls with the local school systems, where they can share what organizations are partnering with them. I know, for example, with delivering food, we provided about 8 million meals during a few months of this pandemic, and we had all kinds of organizations working with us to reach out to parents. We had taxi drivers delivering meals. We had school bus drivers. We had other organizations coming in and assisting us putting the meals together, since we did breakfast, lunch, dinner, and a snack. And we are still continuing that effort. So, it's just a partnership that we work on every week to find out what are the best resources. And we share that, because sharing that information is so crucial, because you don't need to reinvent the wheel. If someone's doing something and it's very effective, let's copy it and do it in other places. So it's really through that weekly contact that we have with our local school systems.
May I interject that national organizations are taking a big role in this area, from the Council of Great City Schools to the Council of Chief State School Officers, to MPI, to a number of even state organizations. They're pulling together networks of teachers. I think we cannot underestimate how stressful this is for teachers right now, and how they're relying on every trick in their bag. And so pulling teachers together to be able to hear from each other, to learn from each other, I think is something that is an important role for national organizations to do during this time. It's a source of support and a source of learning for teachers.
Thank you, both of you. Those are both really great points. And I think we have time for about 2 more questions. So I'm going to direct this one to Superintendent Kang. So this one is from Amy Fairbanks. And did the prioritized plans for returning emerging bilingual students to this in-person learning distinguish between kind of those different levels of language proficiency? You know, are districts prioritizing newcomers over students who are kind of in the middle phases or the advanced stages? Or is it really kind of prioritized equally?
It's a great question. So as I mentioned in the sort of background about DC, we have more than 60 different local education agencies across our city, and they vary greatly in size and grade ranges served and approaches and so on. And so different LEAs are taking different approaches as they are thinking about bringing some small groups of students back in some cases for in-person instruction. Many of our LEAs have started the year actually in full virtual posture, so are not yet bringing any students back. But we basically, in the local education agency plans that were submitted to my office and that are being reviewed right now jointly by my staff, as well as the Public Charter School Board for our public charter LEAs, we've asked questions specifically about how you are serving your English learner students, and for any groups of students you are prioritizing for in-person instruction, how are you determining that, and how are you serving those students well, as well as the important questions around family engagement, as we've talked about. How are you communicating with all families, in what formats, in what languages, and how are you then incorporating that feedback to improve your instructional approach? So there's not one single answer here, but we do, our staff is available and continues to talk about sort of how to help LEAs really think about what their needs are and have a thoughtful approach. I think there can be multiple answers to the question that was posed, but the most important thing is just to consider what makes the most sense in a specific LEA's context. And then the last thing I would say is I completely agree with the last exchange around how to best connect people and help practitioners work through these questions together. We, over the summer, did what we called a Listen, Learn, and Lead series, where essentially we brought together points of contact who may not always have the chance to connect within different local education agencies. So not just the leader, but different role types around particular topics. And it was sort of an informal chance for we'd tap a couple of people to present some ideas, share some of the things they are doing, and then allow for sort of an open dialogue to help people. And I think for all of us, continuing to find those spaces of connection that are structured enough to be helpful, but informal enough to allow for in the moment, real time sort of problem solving as we all navigate this crisis are really important.
Thank you so much. And I think we just have time for one more quick question before we wrap up. And this is going to be for all 3 of our panelists. During a lot of our webinars, including this webinar, we are so focused on some of these challenges that we've faced for the last 6 months that it can feel kind of heavy and difficult to get past. And so we like to try to end some of our conversations with, you know, what are you feeling optimistic about as it relates to this area, and what are you really looking forward to over the next few months and years that you think may come from this? And I know this is something we briefly touched on, but I just wanted to give all of you a chance to kind of offer those last closing thoughts really quickly. Is there anyone who'd like to start?
Sure, I'll start. To answer
Thanks,
a little bit earlier, I think what gives me hope is how people have responded. I think the fact that we have many, many questions and people clamoring for answers is an indication that we're not ignoring this population, that we're trying. I think as a long-term goal, as I mentioned earlier, there are lots of things we need to keep, lessons we need to keep from this pandemic, but most importantly, I think it's important to remember the vulnerability of this population. And I think this pandemic sort of put a microscope on some existing inequities, and we need to remember the lessons we learned from that this time.
I guess I would just like to say that from what I'm seeing and what I hope to see over the next month as I visit schools that are opening for small groups of students is that these students are being well served. I totally agree with the fact that I think this is a population of students that people tend to overlook. And I think we need to have a laser-like focus on what they've lost and how we can provide the means for them to recoup their learning and also to excel in their learning, because these are very bright people. I marvel at the fact that people speak multiple languages and feel inept myself that I don't. And I think it's just amazing what we can learn from each one of these students. And I just hope that we can get more students back into school sooner than later, because they are really missing out on the interaction with their teachers.
For me, I think what gives me hope, both in the short term and something that I hope we can carry forward into the long term to help us all get better over time, is really we were forced into it, obviously, but the closer connection and the deeper understanding between families and educators. I think families, have a closer look now into what school really is like for their students in this moment, but thinking about what that could mean for the future. And educators have a different appreciation for what it means to have a partnership with families. It is a more direct and deep connection because of the circumstances that we're all in. And I think it will be really interesting when we can, resume the kinds of activities that we all want to and be in person again. What would it look like to try and hold on to that experience of a deeper and closer partnership? And what might that mean for the future of our ability to serve students and families well, including especially our English learners. So I'm hopeful about that potential.
Thank you. I think those are all three really great things to look forward to, and I'm looking forward to seeing some of the work that comes out of what your states are doing, what your organizations are doing, and what we're just doing generally as a country. So unfortunately, we are out of time today, but I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Commissioner Fonte Green, who unfortunately had to jump off a little early, Superintendent Salmon, Superintendent King, and Delia Pompa for joining us and for taking the time to have this really thoughtful discussion. We had so many questions submitted today, so we're very sorry if we weren't able to get to one of your questions, or if you pre-submitted a question and we weren't able to get to that either. But please feel free to join us next Wednesday at 11:30 a.m. We will be having a Twitter town hall with Superintendent King and Commissioner Infante Green, as well as our President and CEO, Dr. Javed Siddiqui. We'll be posting a recording of this presentation as well as a recap blog on the Hunt Institute website later this week, so please check back for that and feel free to share it with your networks. The Hunt Institute also has a lot of webinar opportunities upcoming, just a couple that are coming up soon. Next Tuesday, September 15th at 11 a.m. Eastern. We will have governing principles with some former governors supporting student transitions in the time of crisis. And then on Thursday, September 17th at 11 a.m., we will have a higher ed focused webinar on some of those financial challenges that institutions of higher ed are focusing in the wake of COVID-19. And so with that, just a quick last minute note on once this webinar is over, you'll be brought to a brief survey just asking about your experience. We'd really appreciate any insight you might have, and all those responses will be kept totally confidential. And if you are interested in finding more resources about past Homeroom webinars or any other COVID-related resources, please feel free to visit the Hunt Institute, and you can find Homeroom-specific information at this URL. With that, thank you again to our panelists. Thank you again to all of you so much for attending and taking time out of your days to be here. Please feel free to reach out to the Hunt Institute with any of your education policy needs, and we will see you at our next webinar. Thank you.